Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is William Henry Harrison by Gail Collins. This book was published in 2012 by Times Books, and it's 153 pages long. Now, I read this book as an e-copy, ebook version, and so I don't have a physical copy of the book, so I printed out the cover so that you can see what it looks like. This book is part of a series called the American President Series that was edited by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Now, these cover all the presidents from George Washington until George W. Bush, and they're short presidential biographies. Each one's about 150 pages long. And the interesting thing about this series is that many of the authors are not professional historians. For example, the volume about Abraham Lincoln was written by George McGovern, the senator and presidential candidate back in the 70s. The volume about Warren Harding was written by John Dean, the lawyer and Watergate conspirator. And the volume about Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, was written by Charles Peters, who was a journalist and the founder of Washington Monthly Magazine, and who worked briefly in the Johnson administration as part of the Peace Corps. So the idea behind this, the reason Schlesinger chose journalists and other non-historians to write a lot of these books, is that he wanted to create a accessible, popular, short history for people that were interested in the presidents but didn't want to plow through a 500 or 600 page biography. And the other thing is, historians often write in a kind of clunky academic prose style, and he wanted to create books that were written in a more of a journalistic style. And so he picked a lot of journalists to do this. Gail Collins, the author of this book, is a journalist with the New York Times. She was, for a while, editor of the New York Times editorial section. Now, William Henry Harrison is famous for just one thing. He's the president who died 31 days after he went into office, the shortest presidency in history. And so he's often forgotten about. All right, this is one of the few biographies of Harrison, actually. And the story that's always told about Harrison is that he gave a long inauguration speech on a cold, wet day, and he stood out in the cold rain without wearing a coat or a hat or a muffler, and he got sick. He got a cold. That cold turned into pneumonia, and then he died 31 days later. Well, that story's not entirely true. It is true that he gave a long speech. It is true that he didn't wear a coat, and he did catch a cold, but he got over it. He actually didn't get really sick until the third week of his presidency. So the first couple of weeks, he was out doing everything he was supposed to do. He was hiring or appointing cabinet ministers, cabinet members, and taking applications for various jobs and so forth. The story that he talked a long time and then got sick and died isn't entirely true. Now, let's talk about why he gave such a long speech. His inauguration speech ran to almost 2 hours, by far the longest inauguration speech in presidential history. Why talk so long? Well, Harrison was elected from the Whig Party, and the Whig Party was opposed to the policies of Andrew Jackson and his follower, successor, Martin Van Buren. So those two guys have been in office and controlled the presidency for 12 years. And so this was a sea change in political life in Washington, a new party coming in. And Harrison wanted to spell out exactly how he was going to be different from the Jackson and Van Buren administrations. For one thing, one of the big issues he talked about at length was the national bank. We had a national bank until Jackson became president, and then he dissolved it because Jackson didn't want the federal government or federal agency controlling too much of the economy. He wanted the economy to be controlled by these different states, right? This is that whole federal versus state thing that went back and forth throughout the 19th century. But the Whig Party believed that a national bank was essential to stabilize the economy. They wanted a national banking policy, and they believed that a national bank could pump money into the economy when there was a recession or what they used to call a panic. And so that was a big issue. So he wanted to establish a national bank, and that was a big debate that went on for decades throughout the 19th century, is whether we should have a national banking system or not. Another issue that he talked about was getting rid of the spoils system. Now, the spoils system is named after the old cliche, To the victor go the spoils. When Jackson became president, he did something that no other president had done before. He fired virtually everybody in the executive branch, diplomats, uh, people in the War Department, and so forth. He replaced almost everybody with people who were personally loyal to him. And believed in his policies. So he wiped out the whole bureaucracy of Washington and replaced them with his own people. And this was very controversial. Jackson's point of view was, I'm the president, I'm in charge of the executive branch, I should be able to choose who I want for these positions. But in doing that, he fired a lot of experienced bureaucrats who'd been around for a long time and who knew what was going on, and it really created a huge upheaval in the government. So Harrison, when he comes in there, he promises he's not going to fire everybody. He's going to allow some non-political people to stay in office. This eventually, what happened eventually is that the government adopted kind of a hybrid system, which is what we still have today. Some people are considered political appointees, and they can be replaced and usually are. Those would be cabinet secretaries, cabinet undersecretaries, and ambassadors. But the people below them, the kind of mid-level bureaucrats in the State Department and the Defense Department and the Commerce Department and so forth, and Weather Bureau, those people are usually have civil service protection, which means they can't easily be fired. And so what happens is you have a set of people that stay there from administration to administration, and they're experienced and know what they're doing, and they carry out the policies of whoever's the president, so you don't have a big government upheaval every time a new president comes in. So that was one of the issues that Harrison was talking about in this long, long speech that he gave. One other thing that he said, he promised not to run for re-election. He promised to just be a one-term president, and that's the one promise he was able to keep because he died a month later. The reason he made that promise is because of his age. Harrison, when he was elected, was 68 years old, which was considered positively ancient in the early 19th century. This is 1841. Most people didn't live that long. And so one of the big attack points, one of the big issues against Harrison when he was running for president was that he was too old to be president. And so Harrison wanted to prove that he was young enough to run, or not too old to be president. He was healthy and vigorous. And so one thing he did, he promised only to run for one term. And that was the reason he stood out in the rain without a coat and a hat or anything, is because he wanted to prove how tough he was. He was a general during the War of 1812. He had won a big victory during the war against Tecumseh's Native American tribes in the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so he had this image of as a war hero and a vigorous guy, and he was always trying to show off that he was not too old to do this. Now, one thing Collins brings up in here is, why did Harrison want to run for president at such an advanced age? I mean, I'm 64. I don't consider myself old, but if I'd been 64 in the 1840s, I would have been on, at death's door. The reason was Harrison was almost broke. He was basically living off a military pension, and he had 10 children, all of whom lived into adulthood, which was unusual for back then. And he had a lot of grandkids, and a number of his kids were sponging off of him, and so he was almost broke. And he ran for president basically because he needed the money. He wanted a stable, good-paying job so that he could kind of support his family. And so a big part of the reason he decided to run is that he couldn't retire. He couldn't live out his old age because he didn't have any money. And when he died, his widow was at Congress actually granted a pension to his widow so that she wouldn't die penniless. So a lot of this was about money, actually, rather than politics, although he was, of course, interested in the Whig positions on things. Okay, so the two main things in this book, obviously, when you've got a president who's only president for 30 days, most of the book's not going to be about his presidency. The two main things that take up this book are the two legacies that Harrison left behind. One was what happened at his death. Of course, he picked John Tyler to be his vice president, and there was a constitutional crisis. Harrison was the first president to die in office, and there was a real question about, well, what is John Tyler's status? The cabinet wanted him to be called acting president, and they wanted him to have limited powers. The argument was, well, he wasn't elected president. He was elected vice president, but he wasn't elected president, so he shouldn't be a full-time president. And so they wanted to be able to have veto power over anything Tyler did. They were basically trying to take over the presidential power while Tyler was president. And Tyler argued that he had the right to be a full powered president, just like any other, because he said, well, the people voted for me too. And so kind of the impasse was broken by the Supreme Court Chief Justice, who met with the cabinet and said, listen, if he takes the oath of office for president, then he should have the same powers as the presidency. Because, when you're vice president, you take a vice presidential oath of office. And so he did that. He took the oath of office and then he became president. And that set the precedent that we still have today. If a president dies in office, the vice president immediately takes the oath of office of presidency and takes on the full power of the presidency. And eventually, after the Kennedy assassination, a constitutional amendment was added to kind of straighten all this out. So that was one thing. His death actually created a legal precedent for the secession of power if the president dies. The second thing that Harrison was important, his legacy, was his presidential campaign. Many presidential scholars consider William Henry Harrison's presidential campaign in 1840 to be the first modern presidential campaign. Before Harrison's time, presidential candidates acted like they didn't want to be president. This goes back to George Washington, who always had the public position that I don't want to be president. You're making me be president. I'm only doing this because the people want me to be president. And every candidate after that took that same attitude. They didn't go out and publicly campaign. They stayed at home. They sent surrogates out to campaign for them. But Harrison campaigned in person. He held big mass rallies of his supporters and he gave speeches to them. And he came up with this catchy slogan that people still remember today, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe being the Battle of Tippecanoe that Harrison won as a soldier. So it was his war hero status. And Tyler, of course, being his vice presidential candidate. So he ran really a modern campaign where you have rallies, political rallies, you gather your supporters, you rile them up with slogans and so forth, and you, very importantly, you go get off your porch and you go out into the public and campaign for the office. Harrison wanted to be president because he needed the money. And so he set a precedent for that we still have today of presidential candidates actively campaigning for president, not pretending that they don't want the office. So if you're interested at all in this rather obscure president and the things he did do. Oh, before I wrap it up, let me do one thing real quickly. I didn't want to say this. How he died. Okay, I said earlier that he got a cold when he gave the speech, but it didn't kill him. He got over it. And it wasn't until the third week that he actually got sick. What happened was he was being surrounded all day long by people who wanted a job. Back then, the president had to approve every single job application in the executive branch. And in 1840, the executive branch was much smaller than it is today, but there were still a lot of people. And so all day long, hordes of people would be pouring into the White House wanting to get a job. And Harrison was exhausted by all these mobs of people, and every time he tried to go somewhere, there were people following him. So he started sneaking out of the White House in the morning and taking a walk, and just walking around trying to get away from everybody and clear his head. And so the third week of his presidency, he was walking to a market to just do some shopping, and he got caught in a heavy rainstorm, and his clothes got soaked. Instead of going back to the White House and changing into dry clothes, he walked around these wet clothes, and it was March, so it was still pretty cold in Washington, and he got sick. And that's what led to him getting ill. And then he might have even then recovered, except that his doctor bled him, which, of course, was the thing people did in the early 19th century, was bleeding people when they got sick. That's what happened to George Washington when he got sick. And then he just got worse and worse and then died. So it wasn't the big speech, the inauguration speech that killed him. It was his walking around in wet clothes when he was trying to get away from other people. Okay, so anyway, the book is William Henry Harrison. The author is Gail Collins. And this has been another Man and Great Book Review. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.